The smell of roasted chicken and a quiet tension filled the elegant dining room of the Mitchell family's old Georgian Mile estate, on the outskirts of Boston. Snow drifted gently outside the tall windows, layering the bare rose garden in pristine white. It looked like a scene from a painting, if I didn't already know what was coming. I'm Eva Mitchell, the youngest of three, though everyone insists on calling me Evie, as if to keep me permanently cast as the child who never quite grew up. I'm 32 this year, unmarried, no children, and far from settled by my mother's standards. Marlene. The kind of woman who believes a woman's worth is measured by the man she marries and how quietly she stays beside him. I chose to live in this house after graduation, not because I lacked other options, but because something here needed watching. And tonight? What I've been waiting for all these years is about to unfold. The French grandfather clock struck 6 exactly, as Donna, our housekeeper of over 30 years, set down the mashed potatoes beside the cold cuts. Our eyes met for a moment. She knew. She always knew more than anyone let on. Eva, sit up straight, my mother snapped from the head of the table, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. The Graces are joining us for dessert tonight. Don't embarrass me. I adjusted my posture, quietly placing the napkin in my lap. Mrs. Grace? A wealthy widow rumored to have had more than a casual connection with my father, and her son, a junior attorney my mother was clearly trying to pair me off with. After all, I was the unsold burden, as she once called me during a phone call she didn't know I overheard. Next to me, my brother Mark looked sharp in a tailored gray suit, holding the hand of his wife Trina, who always looked at me like I was hired help instead of family. Mark took over Dad's investment firm 5 years ago after Dad announced a strategic retreat. In truth, it was damage control after a bad real estate bet in Florida. But in our family, the truth is either sugar-coated or pushed onto someone else's plate. My sister Vanessa sat at the far end, scrolling through her phone despite Mother's repeated dagger-eyed glances. She'd burned through 2 trust funds and 3 marriages, yet somehow still wore the title of our last hope, simply because she at least tried to play the wife role properly. Before anyone could carve the bird, my father, Charles, set his wineglass down hard. Before we begin, I think it's time we talk about something more important. This house. At those words, I set my fork down, my heartbeat steady, not from fear, but from knowing the hour had come. I had been waiting 3.5 years for this moment. This house, he continued, has carried the Mitchell name for 4 generations. But the real estate market is shifting. We need to make a practical decision. Translation: Mark's firm is hemorrhaging money. Translation: Dad can no longer cover the losses with shuffled assets. Translation: I'm getting kicked out. Or so they thought. Mark leaned forward, wearing the same smug grin I've wanted to slap since grade school. Just say it, Dad. Eva, it's time you moved out. We're selling the house. You've stayed here long enough. I took a sip of water, letting the silence stretch a little longer. Is that so? Vanessa finally looked up from her screen. You didn't think you could just live here forever, did you? Some of us actually have families to think about. You mean your latest fiancé and his 3 kids from previous marriages? I said with a small smile. Has he burned through your last trust yet, or is he still saving for the next yacht trip? Mother's eyes flared, but Mark cut in fast. The market's strong right now. We've already had interest from several high-end developers. They're offering top dollar to build luxury condos. Tear it down, then. My mother clutched her chest. But Mark, this house is just bricks and mortar, Mother, he interrupted. A new era calls for new decisions, and Eva needs to learn how to stand on her own 2 feet. You're giving me 1 week? I asked, setting the glass back down. 7 days is more than generous, Mark sneered. I smiled. Perfect. The game had officially begun. I still remember that Christmas dinner 3 years ago, when Mark loudly called me the useful shadow, because I volunteered to help Vanessa cover her hospital bills after she broke her leg ice skating in Vermont. When I said I'd pay so she wouldn't have to sell her last engagement ring, The whole family looked at me like I was trying to earn points or beg for sympathy. No one asked where the money came from. They simply assumed I had extra since I didn't carry any family burden. 4 months later, at my father's 60th birthday party, he publicly thanked Mark for carrying the family through the financial crisis, while I knew full well that I was the one behind the commercial loan restructuring plan that helped Mitchell & Co. avoid shareholder lawsuits. Of course, Mark signed that plan. I was just the digital little sister with too much free time who likes to play with software, as Vanessa once mocked me during a lunch with my mother at the Newton Ladies Club. Over the years, I'd grown used to the looks. Part pity, part condescension. My mother would often say, "You're smart, but not practical." My father was softer, "Real business isn't for dreamers." They never visited my office, even though I worked only a 30-minute drive away. In their eyes, tech was some vague, unstable thing. A daughter with no husband, working at a startup, might as well have been pretending to succeed. So when Mark said I had to leave the house, no one expected me to do anything but nod quietly, like I always did. They were used to an agreeable Eva, the one who avoided conflict, who backed away so the family could save face. What they didn't know was that I had been quietly preparing for this moment over the last 3 years. After dinner that night, I went back to my room, the one on the 3rd floor that used to belong to my grandmother, and pulled up the account statements from the parent company behind the property listing. A limited liability company called Elan Ventures. An unremarkable name, unless you knew that I had founded Elan in 2020. As part of a long-term real estate investment plan, under its name I had acquired ownership of the Mitchell estate from the bank, after my father secretly used the property as collateral for a failed commercial investment in Houston, a loss he never told anyone about. I knew because the bank mistakenly sent me an email assuming I was Elan's financial assistant. From there I dug deeper. I found out the loan had been in default since last spring, and the asset had been internally listed for liquidation. I, under Elan Ventures, placed a 5% deposit and signed the purchase agreement with a confidentiality clause on the new owner's identity. That's why I didn't react at dinner. I didn't need to argue. I had already won. But the plan wasn't over. I didn't just want to keep the house. I wanted to expose the entire web of financial manipulation that Mark and my father had been operating. They weren't just using the family name to deceive investors. They were using me as a shield. Loan guarantee documents bore forged signatures. Board meetings were held in secret, where I was referenced as senior tech consultant, but never invited. I started archiving emails, taking screenshots, collecting bank statements, loan contracts, and wire records. Donna, the loyal housekeeper, quietly handed me letters she found in Mark's liquor cabinet drawer. Threats from creditors, breach notices for an office lease in Manhattan. I continued attending family dinners calmly, still brought my mother peonies every Saturday, still called to check on Vanessa every time she went through another breakup. I sat still, fingertips resting lightly on the walnut table, feeling the chilled condensation on my glass. Mark was going on and on about the development potential of the land, his tone as confident as if he were pitching to Wall Street investors, not kicking his own sister out of the house she grew up in. "I have a proposal," I said calmly, so much so that the entire table fell silent. Mark raised an eyebrow with mocking amusement. "Ava, this isn't the time for personal reflections." "It's not a reflection." I pushed my chair back gently, reached beside me and pulled out a black leather briefcase from under the table. "Just a few documents that should be reviewed before anyone signs any agreements to sell this house." My father sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ava, you're making this complicated. We've already decided, the house will be sold within 3 weeks." "No, Dad." I opened the briefcase and pulled out a leather-bound file. The embossed logo of Woodrow and Keene Law Firm stood out clearly on the first page. "This house was sold 2 years ago." The room went dead silent. Trina set her spoon down on her plate, the small clink sounding like a gunshot in the quiet. "What?" Vanessa was the first to speak. You're joking, right? I placed the file on the table, turning it so the title faced them. Ellen Ventures LLC. Sole owner. Me. Purchase completed, May 18th, 2 years ago. Full ownership of the property at 3119 Elmhurst Lane. This house was transferred from Huntington Bank after the mortgage loan went into default. That's impossible, Mark stood up abruptly. The bank can't sell it without notifying us. Don't you remember? I smiled. That loan was secured by a personal guarantee, using my signature, a forged one. I hired a handwriting expert nearly 3 years ago to verify it. Mark went pale. You're making this up. This is fake. Then you'll love the forensic signature report included in Section 4, along with the formal complaint I submitted to the Massachusetts Department of Justice last month. I flipped another page, laying down property tax certificates for the past 3 billing cycles. I've paid every property tax bill since the transaction was finalized. And to avoid shocking Mom, I kept the ownership registered under the company's name, not mine. No, this can't be, my mother stammered. I turned to her gently. I wasn't hiding it, I just waited for the right moment. And that moment is now. Now for what? My father gripped the arm of his chair. To humiliate us? At Christmas dinner? I nodded without flinching. Not to humiliate, to remind. Because everyone here seems to forget that I'm not the freeloading daughter, I'm the co-founder of NovaForge, the AI-based supply chain software company that went public this past June. Mark looked like he couldn't breathe. That silly startup? But silly startup, I nodded again, was valued at $4.2 billion on its first day of trading. I hold 12% equity. I'm not bragging, I'm just stating that I no longer owe anyone here silence. Rena looked at Mark, her face drained of color. Vanessa said nothing, just lowered her head. I went on. I stayed quiet for long enough. When I discovered Mark used my name to secure those loans, I could have sued immediately. But I wanted to see the full web. Now I have everything. Documents, bank confirmations, internal accounting files, even emails Mark sent to brokers, forging my approval to vacate this house. My father stood up, hands trembling. You don't understand. I did all of this to keep the company alive. At the cost of destroying the family's legacy? I said coldly. Or by gambling the Mitchell name on unstable investments, and blaming the daughter who refused to pick the right industry. No one spoke. Even the grandfather clock seemed to have stopped ticking. I stood, closing the folder. You have 7 days to gather your things, but given the circumstances, I think 24 hours is more appropriate. I looked directly at Mark, my gaze cutting like glass. After all, you said I needed to learn to stand on my own. Now it's your turn. I turned and walked out, leaving behind faces that could no longer recognize themselves in the mirror of truth. I returned to the dining room after letting them sit in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Long enough for the pretense to melt away. Long enough for each family member to start looking at one another differently. Not as loved ones, but as accomplices, as enablers. Or worse, as the ones behind it all. Trina was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling. Ava, you're not planning to take this to court, are you? I mean, we're still family. I sat down, opened my laptop and plugged in a small silver USB. You should ask Mark. Because if we're talking about betraying family, he started it. Years ago. Mark stood, voice sharp. You're making this up, no one's going to believe your lies. I said nothing, just played a video I had queued up. The screen showed the hallway of the 8th floor at Mercy Hospital in Cambridge, dated April 12, 2 years ago. The footage was clear. Mark in a long gray coat walking into room 8, 10 and 12, at 11 p.m. That was Aunt Lana's room. My father's younger sister. The only one in the family who still believed in me. At the time, she was in the hospital, recovering from a minor stroke. Around then, I discovered her original will, leaving the Nantucket house and nearly $2 million in investments to me. I secretly backed up a copy to my personal drive. I had my doubts, and I was right. The video continued, now with audio. Aunt Lana's frail voice. Mark. I've made up my mind. Eva's the only one who never used me. Then Mark's voice, low but clear. And you think the rest of us will let that happen? Not long after, her condition suddenly worsened. 36 hours later, she passed away. A new will surfaced. Filed by Mark's close legal associate. All assets redirected to Mark, for the protection of family interests. My mother gasped. Oh my God. I zoomed in on the final moments. Mark leaving the hospital room at 12:37 a.m., holding a large envelope. 10 hours later, Mitchell and Hines Law received the emergency will that overrode the previous document entirely. Vanessa stared at Mark, eyes wide. Don't tell me, you pressured her? I cut in. Not just pressure. He hid every dollar that followed using a shell company network built with a group of former employees. It took me nearly a year to trace each link. 14 corporations across Delaware, Montana, and Wyoming. Each one a front to receive funds from real estate development loans signed under Mitchell & Co. I pulled out another thick file. In total, $12,300,000 were cycled through and skimmed into private accounts. Some bought luxury watches, others paid for a charter yacht in Miami. The same one Trina showed off on Instagram as a gift from her husband. Trina turned pale. Mark shouted, "You have no proof of any of this." I laid another stack of papers on the table, neat as a knife to a cutting board. Transaction records, bank statements, and audio of your call with Trevor, your former CFO, who's now fully cooperating with federal investigators for immunity. I paused, then said slowly, "Oh, and he's also turned over internal emails proving you ordered the falsification of the 2021 balance sheet." My father looked at Mark, his face aging a decade in mere minutes. "Mark, what have you done?" Mark clenched his fists and said nothing. The entire room felt frozen in a mix of horror and collapse. I spoke each word clearly. All of this will be submitted to the SEC and the district attorney's office tomorrow morning. I stayed quiet, not because I was weak, but because I wanted to make sure no one could walk away from this. Vanessa got up and left the table, hands clutching her head. Trina wept. My mother gripped the armrest, breathing hard. And Mark? Mark just stared at the laptop, where Aunt Lana's image was slowly fading. I gently closed the screen. And this is only the prelude. Vanessa returned to the dining room just as I was gathering the files. Her phone was buzzing non-stop in her hand. She was pale as a sheet, gripping the screen so tightly her knuckles stood out. "Eva, your phone. It's from the Boston field office of the FBI." I nodded. "Yes, they'll be here in 10 minutes. I sent them all the documents and the video this morning, after receiving final confirmation from the bank." My mother practically screamed. "You called the police on your own family on Christmas Eve?" I looked her straight in the eye. "Mom, if family was a reason to stay silent, then you all should have protected me 18 years ago. Instead of sending me to boarding school just for asking why the company had 2 accounting systems." My father said nothing. He sat there, staring at the floor like he was replaying every word he'd ever said to me. "Don't be suspicious, don't disrupt stability." But tonight the mask had fallen, and that so-called stability was nothing more than a cover for embezzlement, deceit, and betrayal. Mark had lost all trace of arrogance. He rushed to the head of the table, hands trembling as he reached for his phone, likely to call a lawyer. I stopped him. "Mark, sit down. If you have any sense left, you won't destroy the only chance you have left to negotiate. I turned to Vanessa, lowering my voice. And one more thing. About your new fiancé, Tyler. Vanessa looked up, eyebrows furrowed. What does he have to do with this? I opened another file, this time showing transfer records. Tyler signed a consulting contract with one of Mark's shell companies. More than that, he helped Mark move money overseas. At least 4 transactions through offshore accounts in Belize and Malta. Vanessa shook her head, as if trying to block it out. No way. He loves me. He said he was buying a house in Vermont for us to start over. With the money from your final trust fund, I cut in. The one he and Mark emptied in just 3 weeks? Vanessa collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. No. Eva. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I sat down beside her. Because you wouldn't have believed me. Just like Mom didn't believe me when I said Mark was manipulating the company. Just like Dad didn't believe me when I brought him the financial reports 3 years ago. A siren echoed in the distance. Not the familiar sound of a late-night taxi or delivery van. This was the sound of law enforcement. Clear, unmistakable, final. Trina jumped up. We can retract our statements, we can still negotiate, right? I didn't look at her. You should worry about yourself. Your signature is on 2 fraudulent contracts. The FBI has the originals. My father shook his head, his voice barely audible. I did all of this just to protect the family's reputation. I stood tall, voice sharper than ever. No. You did all of this to protect your power and the image you forced on us. But the cost was truth and trust and freedom. A loud knock came at the front door. Donna, the elderly housekeeper, hesitated, then stepped forward to open it. 2 FBI agents entered, followed by a plainclothes officer with a badge from the SEC. Mr. Charles Mitchell and Mr. Mark Mitchell, one of the agents called out. You are under arrest for financial fraud, securities fraud, and obstruction of a federal investigation. No one reacted. Not a word of protest. Mark placed his phone on the table. My father stood up without resistance, as if he'd known this moment was coming for years. As they were handcuffed and led out of the room, I met my mother's gaze. It was no longer filled with blame or disdain, but hollow, like someone who'd just realized the entire world they built had crumbled. I stepped toward her and gently placed an envelope on the table. You can open this when you're ready. It's a lease agreement for a small apartment in Sarasota, Florida. A quiet place. I've paid the first 12 months, and if you want to start over, it's not too late. She held the envelope in silence. Donna quietly placed a hand on her shoulder, a wordless gesture of comfort. Meanwhile, Vanessa quietly pulled out her phone and deleted an old photo, the one of her smiling brightly beside Tyler and her engagement ring. No one said a word. But that silence weighed heavier than any indictment. I looked out the window, where snow had begun to blanket the road leading away from the estate. Christmas Eve continued on. 9 months after that fateful Christmas Eve, the mansion at 3119 Elmhurst Lane no longer resembled a fortress built for gilded lies and hollow conversations. The grand portrait of great-grandfather Mitchell that once hung in the main stairwell had been taken down, replaced by a vibrant abstract painting gifted by a student from the very first digital arts class. I named the place Catalyst House, a space for new beginnings. It's a completely free community center for teens in the Boston area who want to learn about technology, leadership skills, and independent thinking. What used to be the bedrooms of Vanessa, Mark, and myself are now computer labs, Arduino programming rooms, a video editing studio, and a creative 3D design space. Donna, who once quietly witnessed more than anyone else in our family, now serves as the center's coordinator, managing class schedules, staff, and students with a calm, commanding grace. Last month, Vanessa emailed me with the subject line, "Finished my first semester." She's now studying applied psychology at a community college in Worcester. No more designer coats, no grand wedding plans. Just photos of her with kids from her mentoring group, and a smile I'd never seen before. I didn't give her much, just enough for tuition, a small apartment, and one condition. She had to work at least 10 hours a week. She did, and exceeded expectations. As for my mother, she moved to Sarasota, Florida, into the apartment I had pre-arranged. At first she refused. But a month later, I received a handwritten letter. No apology, just a simple line. "Thank you for holding on to a bit of kindness for me." I've heard she joined a local book club and is writing children's stories. It doesn't change the past, but I believe if anything deserves forgiveness, it's the commitment to live rightly once you've acknowledged your wrongs. The trial ended after 6 weeks. Mark was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for financial fraud, falsifying legal documents, and money laundering. The evidence that he threatened Aunt Lana to alter her will, along with the hospital video, led the jury to a verdict in less than a day. Trina, due to her cooperation with federal investigators and providing key information, received a 3-year suspended sentence and is barred from working in finance during that time. She's now divorced, living with her mother in Ohio, away from the spotlight. My father received 12 years. I once thought he'd fight it, but he stayed silent throughout the entire trial, bowing his head as the judge handed down the sentence. I don't know what hurt him more, the punishment, or the realization that everything he built collapsed under the weight of the daughter he once called an obstacle. I didn't feel triumph, just emptiness. Some failures are born from the warped values we cling to the most. On a Wednesday morning in early October, I stood on the porch watching students file into class. A 15-year-old boy waved with a bright smile. He had just been accepted into a summer tech camp sponsored by the NovaForge Foundation. Once suspended for tampering with classroom equipment, he now leads a team developing an app that helps the visually impaired navigate smart city maps. That's why I created this place, not to fix my family's legacy, but to build a new one. At the end of the hallway, the long dining table that once witnessed my family's unraveling now hosts young minds debating startup ideas, pitching projects, or simply laughing at a tech joke. I don't call this justice. I call it a meaningful restart. I looked up through the window as snow began to fall gently. Winter had returned. But this year, there was no fear, no tension buried beneath antique walls. Only laughter, the hum of 3D printers, and the quiet belief that cycles can be broken. If we're brave enough to confront them, patient enough to rebuild, and most of all, strong enough never to look back. 3 months after the verdicts for Mark and my father were announced, I stepped into the conference room on the 41st floor of Mitchell Holdings, the investment firm founded by my family, where for years I was only ever referred to as the tech girl on the sidelines. This time was different. At the long table sat 11 board members and 2 representatives from Miller Crosby Capital, one of the firm's largest stakeholders. At the head of the table was an empty chair, the one that used to belong to my father. Beside it was Philip Crane, former CFO, and the same man who ignored every email I sent when I discovered financial discrepancies 3 years ago. I stood next to my legal counsel, silent. A second later, the large screen behind me lit up with the title, Special Shareholder Meeting, Motion to Announce Ownership Structure Changes. Pages flipped. Philip raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Mitchell, what exactly are you referring to? No one on the board has been informed." "I have the right to convene under Special Clause 4.6 of the shareholder agreement. All documents were filed with the exchange last week," I replied evenly. "Shall we begin?" I pressed a button on my laptop. The screen shifted to a diagram showing a network of investment entities. 14 legal entities operating across 6 states that had quietly acquired scattered shares of Mitchell Holdings over the past 18 months. On behalf of these holding entities, I now control 47.8% of voting shares. Including proxy rights from Miller Crosby, the total rises to 62.4%. A board member named Langford choked. "This can't be real." I started accumulating shares when Mark began dumping stock to cover losses. Every time they needed liquidity, I was the buyer. Through companies no one suspected. No one in the family ever thought I cared enough about finance to do something like this. I looked him square in the eye. And that underestimation is exactly why I succeeded. Philip tried to regain footing. But you can't just restructure leadership because you hold shares. I'm not requesting. I turned the next slide. I'm informing. According to the company's charter, I propose establishing an independent oversight committee and temporarily suspending all executive authority of directors linked to the 20202 misconduct. That includes Philip Crane, Lauren McKay, and Anthony Rudd. A hand went up from the Miller-Crosby side. The fund supports this proposal. I faced the board. I also propose appointing myself as chair of the board, assuming interim executive authority during the restructuring period. I paused. Any objections? 10 seconds of silence, no movement. Motion passed. I shut my laptop. The internal audit begins tomorrow. All transactions involving shell companies, off-balance assets, and collateral funds will be fully investigated. Philip stood, his lips trembling. You're going to destroy the whole company? I looked him dead in the eye. I'm going to save it. What we have now is a hollow shell of a reputation. I'm going to rebuild it. Transparent, efficient, and worthy of the public trust the name Mitchell once held. Leaving the boardroom, I stood in the elevator, looking down at a fog-covered Boston. In my coat pocket was the 3-year transformation plan, turning Mitchell Holdings into a sustainable investment platform, focused on tech innovation and community impact. Some might call me harsh, cold, even ruthless. But they don't know how many years I was sidelined, how many times my name was crossed out simply because I refused to stay silent, refused to play by the old rules. That night, when the lights on the 41st floor had gone out, I sat alone in the empty boardroom, the glow of my laptop screen reflecting off the large glass window. The early winter wind swept through the streets of Boston below. The city was still awake. And so was I. The phone rang. The screen lit up with the name, Madeline Granger. I picked up. I've been expecting you. Her voice was soft and low, tinged with a quiet nostalgia. I have something from your grandmother. She told me only to pass it on when you were strong enough not to need it, but still humble enough to understand why you were chosen. 30 minutes later, I walked into an old cafe on Tremont Street, once a regular meeting spot for my grandmother and her financial circle back when she chaired the City Investment Council. Madame, her last trusted aide, sat at a corner table, a thick envelope tied with red string in front of her. Your name was never listed in your grandmother's public wills, she said, sliding the envelope across the table. She didn't believe the law could protect decent people from the greed of their own family. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed slightly, but her handwriting remained firm and deliberate. My dearest Eva, if you're reading this, it means you've reached the very end of your pain. And instead of letting it consume you, you've turned it into action. You are the only one in this family who understands that real value doesn't lie in a Forbes ranking or an investment contract, but in the things you do when no one's watching. I established a trust fund in your name when you turned 18. It was kept outside of our family's financial systems, built quietly, piece by piece, from small investments I hand-picked myself. Its current value is approximately $86 million. That money is not for revenge. It's for a beginning. Use it to build something our family has never truly had, a legacy of integrity. Your grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell. I sat frozen. Not because of the number, but because she had seen my true self. Long before I was old enough to believe I was different. Madeline placed a hand on the envelope. Your grandmother knew she couldn't protect you forever, but she believed that someday you wouldn't need protecting. Just a chance. She paused, then added quietly. Just like she once gave me that chance, when your father tried to fire me for refusing to falsify interest rate data. Her smile flickered behind thick-rimmed glasses. Your grandmother used to say, if you're not brave enough to lose one person, you'll never be worthy of leading 10. I nodded, stood up, and clasped her hand tightly. Thank you. Not just for the letter. The next morning, I signed the founding papers for the Eleanor Initiative, a nonprofit alliance connecting tech education with green industry sectors, aimed at creating jobs for young adults without college degrees. A portion of the $86 million went in as seed capital. The rest, I left untouched. A reminder that true power isn't in what you control, but in what you choose to release. That afternoon I returned to Catalyst House. The kids were laughing, clustered around a round table, coding a game in Python. Donna came out with a new letter. From Vanessa. She'd just secured an internship at a youth reintegration center. At the bottom she wrote, I get it now. No one is born perfect. But if you're lucky, you get to try again. Thanks to the people who didn't give up on you. I looked up at the wall where the Mitchell family crest once hung. Now it bore a simple board with the words, Let what you build echo louder than what others destroyed. I knew I'd made the right choice. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't ending the past. It's making sure it never happens again. Eva's story is a powerful reminder that true recognition doesn't come from a family name. It comes from courage and resilience in the face of injustice. In a world where integrity is often overlooked, Eva didn't seek revenge through destruction, she chose to rebuild, with strength, compassion, and vision. In real life, if you've ever been dismissed simply for being different, remember this. You don't need to fit their mold to have worth. You just need the courage to be yourself all the way through. What do you think about Eva's choice? Was she too harsh, or was she simply reclaiming what she rightfully deserved? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more meaningful stories about family and life.